One thing that is really helpful when you're designing a project of any sort, really, is to have some way of judging if your project is any good. And you might say, well, I know if it's any good. I just look at it and it's good or not. And that's a kind of immediate reaction. That's terrific. But often we have some kind of underlying philosophy. And frequently we don't even we're not even conscious of that philosophy that we're using to judge our projects. And so usually, if you're in an architectural setting, you're trying to come up with some kind of, it's either a philosophy or a manifesto or even just a methodology that's going to help you determine, is your project any good? And by all means, I think for a lot of you, when you look at a project, your immediate response is sort of like, oh yeah, I like that. Or no, I don't like that. But what's going on behind that? What makes you have that immediate response? Is it the materials? Is it the color? Is it the location? Is it the time of day? Is it the furnishings? What is it that helps you to respond or helps you to come up with some kind of overarching judgment? Yep, it's good. Or nope, it's not. And in fact, in the most cases, like this is a John Lautner house, famous designer from the 60s, he did a lot of things which are very much of that time, sort of funky shapes, a lot of thin shell concrete, and a lot of open plans, giant windows, and it's, in my mind, it's a very lovely to look at design. But if you start looking at other criteria, concrete, maybe not always the most sustainable material, big open sheets of glass, not always the most energy efficient. And then, of course, you have other issues. Is it appropriate to the climate? Do you really want such cold materials on your feet? Are the furnishings correct for this period and for this client? Are the acoustics good for a grand piano? Probably not. So there's a number of ways you can look at these projects. So, and I've outlined a couple of basic ideas here, sort of what I could come up with, and when I'm grading your projects, I am frequently working with a kind of mental rubric of elements, and one of the most basic ones is, does it function, and does the design that you've come up with work as an architectural design? And yeah, if you design a doorknob, awesome. It might look good, but does it work as a doorknob? Is it sized for the human hand? Does it unlock the door? These sorts of things are, kind of important. And these can be applied to small scale elements, larger elements like spaces, rooms, or otherwise. And do they function with the intent that you have? If you want a commercial kitchen, for example, does it function as a commercial kitchen? We can study that. We can study ergonomics and proxemics and decide if the kitchen works or not. Now, other things, things like historical elements. If you're designing an in the arts and crafts style, does it actually use arts and crafts elements in it? This is a Tiffany lamp, and yes, that would be an appropriate choice, whereas some other more modern element would not be appropriate. We are psychological beings, right? We design for people mostly, although not always, and we have associations based on our personal experience that we are not always aware of, like what makes a cozy space. What you picture in your mind might be sitting and reading by a window, and how nice is that? That's very cozy. But if you're from, say, an island, like, I don't know, Tahiti, maybe what's cozy is different for you. We have our own associations that are very powerful and very difficult to escape. So it's important to think through who's your client and what sorts of associations do they have. Even things like colors can be very powerful, and yet every culture has different associations with different colors. Just look at the colors of wedding dresses in the US, for example, are typically white, and in China they're red. So there you go. We also have social systems that we are designing for, right? We typically have spaces in our project that are meant for use by more than one person. They're often meant to support an activity. And we can analyze that space and decide if it's successful for the activity we have at hand. And of course, it is important in the programming stage to identify those activities. But then as your design progresses, well, you said you wanted a cozy living room where everyone can sit by the fire. Can everyone sit by the fire and not burn their toes? Or does everyone get sort of equal access to the fire? These are ways of looking at the social use of a space and trying to determine if it works. Now, often in antiquity, people used mathematical reasoning. Say, oh, does it follow some classical proportion like this golden rectangle, or some kind of harmonic proportions, musical or otherwise? These are things which have been used to judge your project, and those often involve things like symmetry also. Now, sometimes you have a project where you want a spiritual kind of connection, and you want the space to be, say, uplifting, to take you away from your mundane daily concerns and help you to think about your lives in a more broad context. And this is true of most religious spaces. So judging your design, does it do that? Does it have elements which make you want to check your phone every 30 seconds? Or does it, somehow draw your eyes, I don't know, upward if you're, in this case, a Christian looking up to the heavens? But sometimes other religions, you're looking inward or you're looking to nature. So it's not universal. Now, the last one is probably the one that's the most important, but also the most difficult to codify and explain, and that's aesthetics. So, is it beautiful? It's perfectly fine to look at your project and say, is it beautiful or not? And I want it to be beautiful. And of course, your clients, if they don't think it's beautiful, if they think it's ugly, they are going to ask you to redo it. So identifying what your aesthetic preferences are is really important. And there's a reason that there's a whole sort of philosophy of art out there. It's really hard to kind of codify. Is it something geometric? Is it something spatial? Is it something tactile, or what? And each of these elements here that I've mentioned can be kind of more important or less important. It kind of depends on the project and your own preferences. And of course, you may succeed at some and not at others. And it's just kind of it's the holistic part that I think the aesthetics take the highest kind of ranking. And frequently, these are related to your concepts. And there's a reason we've been discussing concepts, and now we are moving on to kind of a design philosophy. And your client may have their own goals, and these are great for guiding you. And they should guide you, because remember, you're paid by your client. Like, that's why we get projects. We are not fine artists, and we are not sculptors. We are architects and interior designers. So anyway, and that your client may, I really want to tread lightly on the earth, or I want to bring beauty into the world. Maybe they have an art collection or something like that. Or maybe they want to make some kind of statement about going off grid. Clients have all sorts of funky ideas, and sometimes those interesting constraints are actually what the root of really good architecture, because it gives you some kind of direction. Anyway, how do you use these kind of philosophies or methodologies? Well, you develop what are typically called terms of criticism. These are elements which you can study your design and say, can I measure the success of my design? So, for example, if you say, one of my goals is net zero operational energy. So no additional energy is needed on my site to do everything that is needed on the site, in our case, living in a private residence. All the energy is generated on site, and everything is efficient enough that we don't need external energy sources. Well, we can calculate that, right? We can calculate energy loads of a typical residence and water needs and all sorts of other stuff, and then come up with an answer. Yes, we have enough energy, right? It's really quite simple. Put enough solar panels and wind turbines, and you're probably doing okay. Now, and then there's plenty of other things, connection to nature, for example. Well, Do you have spaces where there is a clear connection to nature? And if so, is that successful? Have you organized the building so that the best views of nature are visible from the interior spaces? And have you arranged your interior spaces so that they function where people can, say, sit and look outside, as opposed to the only place to sit is facing an interior wall? So these are measurable sorts of terms of criticism. And I have a link here to a funny advice on writing a manifesto, kind of a satire. And I think sometimes we get a little serious when we talk about architectural theory. So it is nice to kind of open yourself up sometimes and have a laugh. Anyway, and these theories, it's a mental scheme. This is kind of the official definition of something to be done, or a method of doing it, and a kind of a systematic statement of rules and principles to be followed. And those principles can be kind of funky, like we learned when we listened to the podcast about people living in a bunker. They have a philosophy which may be a little nutty, about, like, I want to get away from everyone everywhere, or the zombie apocalypse is upon us. Let's hide. But it's a philosophy, no question about it, and you can judge their designs based on their own philosophy. But more often than not, either you come up with a concept first, or you have something in the back of your mind. I really wanted a connection to nature, so my concept is going to be a mushroom, and then you work backwards from the concept you come up with to see, well, why did I choose that concept? Sometimes we are learning as much about ourselves as about our designs when we do these sorts of exercises. And design absolutely is not a linear process. It's a spiral, right? Or a circle sometimes. So my advice is that, every time you have to find some kind of theory to support your work, and kind of terms of criticism to judge it, begin by going with your gut. What do you think is the right type of solution in this setting? And frequently, going with your gut is great because you have a sort of what's called a mental schema in your mind already of why the world works the way it does. And this is based on your sociological background, your cultural background, your psychological experiences. It's quite complex. So sometimes it's just hard to categorize and systematize. Now, that said, there are quite a few philosophers out there, and I'm going to do a kind of 10-cent survey of architectural theories. This is not a comprehensive list by any means, but these are theorists that you will hear of in classes by all means. Beginning with Vitruvius, a famous architect from Roman times, and he wrote these 10 books of architecture. I think he's the one that wrote that. And the famous element of that is, how do you judge if your architecture is beautiful and is successful? And it's these three things: firmness, commodity, and delight. Firmness being the building's kind of built structural integrity. Is it going to fall down? Which, if you live in an area subject to earthquakes and volcanoes, that's not a small task. The commodity: does it actually work for what you said it's supposed to work for? Is it efficiently arranged? And then finally, delight: is it beautiful? Right? And aesthetic qualities, he had a whole kind of systematized way of studying that, based on the goddess Venus, which lent style and proportion and other sorts of things. So, and a lot of what the Romans came up with in their sort of the architecture that remains followed these sorts of things, these sorts of ideas about proportion and shape and other things in the projects that they created. So, and for the longest time during the Renaissance, or during the Middle Ages, these classical elements were kind of lost or not used a whole lot. I mean, there was various revivals and whatnot, but it wasn't really till the Renaissance that a lot of these sort of overarching philosophies came back, in the notion of kind of humanism and the age of humanism, and that humans are the measure of all things. And there was also a sort of romanticism for classical Greek and Roman forms and the proportions that they had. And and so a lot of the buildings, this is one of the Andrea Palladio buildings, are kind of famously very rigorously laid out in proportions. It has bilateral symmetry. It's kind of a cube shape, and the proportions are extremely precise. And it's kind of like an obsessive nostalgia for ancient proportions. And these were kind of, I don't know, summarized as humanism, and that humans are the measure of all things. And this famous drawing from Da Vinci, the Vitruvian man, is that everything is based on the proportions of the human. Now, of course, we all know that humans are actually like we're almost symmetrical laterally or in a linear way, but not totally. Like one arm is always longer than the other, and nothing is quite as perfect as it works out in these lovely diagrams. So, and a lot of that classicism and neoclassicism kind of governed for a long time, really until we started getting into the, I don't know, late 19th century, and when we started building taller and using construction systems that had not been around before, using steel and steel frames and building tall buildings. And Louis Sullivan was probably one of the first who said that the form of the building should follow its function. That's kind of his famous thing. And part of it is this new style of building where the buildings are taller. And so the traditional decorative systems that you saw in classical architecture, they just don't work anymore. And his ideas eventually got extended and kind of refined by the Bauhaus. But in its simplest form, this is a tall building, and you might look at it and say, well, it's quite ornate. But at the time, it lacked all the traditional elements that you would see in kind of fine architecture, the traditional orders, the Corinthian versus Ionic, and all that kind of stuff, and porticos and other knickknacks that are decorative systems. Now, not that he didn't have wonderful decorative systems. They were more kind of naturalistic than had ever been seen before, really kind of lush detail. But I think his philosophy was the buildings are so tall, you cannot do this over the whole building. You have to kind of select where these details are going to occur, and you have to make these details articulated with a modern aesthetic. Now, Corbusier is going and kind of taking that to its ultimate end. I'm not sure he's really part of the Bauhaus or if he's kind of on his own, but it's very similar in that it's very minimalist. And he actually had 5 elements that he said, everything has to have these elements, or at least should have these elements in order to be a successful building. And they absolutely aesthetically are kind of the end result of what Sullivan started, which is kind of stripping off all the detail of a building. And they include a number of fairly specific things that we see in kind of modern architecture nowadays. Pilottis, maybe not so much. Those are columns that elevate the mass off the ground. But I think his response to the history of architecture, where it was kind of rooted in the earth, right? The buildings grew out of the earth and were subject to the gravity and the weight of the construction systems. Well, now we don't have that problem anymore. We're building with steel. We can make these as light as we want. And other things, a free plan and a open facade, that sort of thing, are very prominent in his architecture. And you can see it looks, this looks pretty different, right? It absolutely does not look like a building anchored on the ground. It looks like it's kind of lightly floating above the ground. And he had his own kind of strange lobster-like human that he believed we were all designing around. And again, a lot of these are extensions of the golden proportion and the Vitruvian man, just updated for his time and his kind of zeitgeist, his way of thinking that was appropriate for the time. Mies van der Rohe, he kind of is the next step in this progression of sort of universal design. In his projects, his philosophy was that space should be undifferentiated, where the greatest number of activities can take place with minimal adjustment. So rather than designing for specific sorts of things, he wanted to design a whole which could contain multiple types of programs. And it really is the basis of modernism that we see, across the world nowadays. This universal approach to design, the open floor plan with as few columns as possible, and you can turn it into an office or a law court or apartments, just depending on how you work it out. And some of his designs are quite kind of lovely and kind of aesthetically appealing. They have lovely materials, but you can see that the overall building is it's really a roof on slender columns. And then what happens underneath that roof, it feels like, oh, that's just a secondary part. It's that roof that encloses these potential activities that's really the important part of this design. And he kind of, one of his most famous buildings is the Seagram's building, and he had this philosophy of kind of proportion and grid that should govern your design, and famously studied his details and the proportions of his, say, window mullions endlessly to get them just right. And one anecdote, which may or may not be true, is the plaza in front of the Seagram's building in New York has lovely brass drainage grates, and they are screwed down with round screws. And supposedly when he was doing the final checklist for the building, he went around with this flathead screwdriver and turned the screw heads so that the slot was oriented with the grid of the rest of his building. Now, if that's not a kind of methodology which you can apply to every architectural element, I can't think of any that's more kind of obsessive. But that's his philosophy, and if those circular screws were not aligned with the grid, it was wrong. That he would judge it as not correct, not good. So anyway, there are other philosophies that came out in the 20th century. Christian Norberg Schultz, famous for what he called the phenomena of place, or it's also called the genus loci, the genius or spirit of the place. And he's famous for kind of thinking about an exact location and really using the site and the materials that you use on that site to make them only appropriate for that one location, that somehow working a building in between the trees and onto the slope, that it only could work there, and that the elements, the materialistic elements of the site are super important. And perhaps one of the great examples of this is Jørn Utsen's Sydney Opera House in Sydney, Australia, out on a promontory sticking into the bay. This building, which is suggestive of the sails of ships in Sydney Harbor, it really only works here. You could not put this building in the middle of Manhattan or Boston, right? It wouldn't make as much sense. But here, in this location, in this direction, it is absolutely unique to this location. Another philosopher or architectural theorist was an architect named Robert Venturi. His famous book is Complexity and Contradiction, and he also has a book called Learning from Las Vegas. And his idea, rather than what Louis Sullivan started, this less is more idea, and certainly I think Mies is the one who is famous for that quote, less is more. He says less is a bore, and he is looking at all the kind of cacophony and curious contradictions that exist in human society, and say, we're gonna embrace that. And interestingly enough, besides embracing like the architecture you see on the Strip in Las Vegas, which is kind of horrifying in some ways, certainly to traditional architecture, he said, no, there's things we can learn from that. Even traditional architectural elements like a gabled roof, he said, well, I'm going to use that, but I'm going to kind of pick it apart and say, what, instead of a ridge at the center, I'm going to crack it open and have a window at the center. Even though that's sort of breaking the rules, he's saying, life is complex and contradictory. There's no reason we should follow old rules, even having the chimney slightly off center, which makes me crazy. But that's what he did, because he felt that contradiction is great. And this led to a lot of postmodernism, where kind of architectural elements are just applique. They're important symbolically, but they are not important as architectural elements. Chris Alexander went a very different direction with his ideas on the pattern language, which is that the way humans inhabit space can be broken down into iconic spatial patterns. And you can kind of use those as ingredients in your recipe for a space, a building. And programming involves finding the most appropriate patterns to apply. And famously, a lot of his residential architecture, which is mostly what he did, employed some of these basic elements. Like in this case, there's a beam across the opening, and that idea of a crossing under a beam, a threshold. You exit the public realm and enter the private realm. That's one of his sort of iconic patterns. But also looking at like a kitchen with an opening onto an outdoor space. That was one of his iconic spaces. Or a room with a low window in the room. We always think, oh, you want to have a view out the window. Well, not necessarily. And each of these had a purpose in his mind and in his philosophy. Another philosophy in this time, and I think we're probably up to the 70s and maybe the 80s now, Kenneth Frampton, an architectural historian, his was critical regionalism, that you should embrace regional unique characteristics, including things like materials or building traditions, even vernacular responses to the climate. And in some cases, like this building in Minneapolis, rather than, oh, let's use Indiana limestone because it's so clear and clean, we're going to use the slightly messier, much more irregular Minnesota sandstone because it really roots the building in its location. It makes it unique. Even though it doesn't have perhaps that clean look of limestone, it has figuring, which is based on the strata of sand deposits in the ancient ocean that covered, that area of the Midwest. Another way to approach this same critical regionalism is Daniel Libeskind, who is another architect based in Berlin, who did a lot of buildings where the kind of architectonic elements, the what's the building built out of, are very contemporary. But he tried really hard in the forms of his building to make reference to historical activities on the site. So this building, which is a museum in Osnabrück, the pattern on the wall is actually kind of the street pattern that was existing historically. In fact, even part of the building, the entrance, has a railroad that existed during World War II for deporting Jews to the concentration camps, and the artist that this museum is for was in fact one of those victims. And so the museum makes reference to elements of the site, the actual history of the site and of the person that it wasn't commissioned by him, but it was built in his honor. So really interesting way to kind of physically make reference to history. Peter Eisenman, kind of what was known at the time as, I guess, deconstructivism, where he kind of studiously avoided traditional architectural forms and kind of exploded his buildings or made them unrecognizable in some ways. And this is a memorial, also a Holocaust memorial, that it creates space, it uses axes, it uses proportion, but it's also kind of deeply disorienting. These are large blocks where you're port underneath these, so you don't really get a sense of where you are. You get kind of lost in this endless machine of space. Or in his houses where he kind of is pulling the walls apart. He's kind of stripping it of any of these traditional sense of architectural elements or even volumes. Everything should be a box, right? The idea of thinking outside of the box is very much what they were about. And Rem Koolhaas, he's a very much an urbanist type of architect. He believed in taking advantage of kind of the chance-like nature of city life and looking to your site in the city to make reference to other acts or other elements in the city and cross-programming. Well, maybe you're near a road or a park system or something like that, or even just something functional like an industry, and using those. and in different ways. And some of his buildings, frankly, are a little funky looking, and but they almost always have some kind of idea. He's trying to look for intersections of different elements, and allow those intersections to generate the architectural form. And frequently these are unique and twisting buildings where they're difficult sites, perhaps sites where there are complex elements that work against each other, and trying to find a solution that resolves these multiple elements. So a real urban solution. Finally, Juhani Pallasmaa is a very contemporary philosopher and architect out of Finland, and for him, it's all about sensualism, the appealing to all of your physical senses. And an example of this, when I was in graduate school, there was a small fountain on campus designed by a blind artist, and the whole idea was that it appealed to your sense of hearing and of touch, and that your experience as you walked through this fountain, and it went from sort of a low level up to a high level on campus, your auditory experience changed as you went through the space, and it really works. It is absolutely very successful as that sort of design. But we can design for smells and sight. So really having this kind of human scale sensitivity to the experience of your project. Super interesting, and not nearly as abstract, kind of very down to earth. A lot of his projects are very, very much this human scale, a lot of tactile elements, textures, that sort of thing, using, I don't know, calendars that are based on plants, so you get different smells and sights during different times of year. All sorts of interesting stuff. Or even just thinking like, how big does my deck have to be in front of my cabin so that it's just the right size for me to sit and enjoy? Not too big, not too little. Not looking for, oh wait, I need a grill and I need this and that and the other thing, but kind of boiling things down to simple, sensual experiences. So interesting philosophy. So each of you should come up with your own manifesto. And this can be based on any of these ideas that I just discussed that you find appealing. And if so, like if you say, I like Pallasmaa, that's a nice sort of interesting philosophy, you might want to hit Wikipedia or something like that to read up a little bit more. My 2-cent explanations are absolutely not thorough at all. And you may just find certain elements appealing. Some people may prefer to just sort of jump into the terms of criticism and work on those first before you can come up with some kind of overarching philosophy. And absolutely, you might want to think about your clients and if there's any elements that they might find appealing. And, are there any things that are unique to them? Do they like to cook? Do they like to forage? Or whatnot? And try to build criteria off of that. But the big goal, list at least 3 terms of criticism. Because I'm going to ask you, when you're done with your schematics, did you do a good job, right? Like, I know what grade I'm going to give you, but I want to know what you think. Can you look at your project and say, well, I was pretty successful. I wanted to make a connection to nature, and I can point to this space where this seating arrangement allows you to sit and look out at the snow that's falling on the trees, or whatever it is, right? I'm just looking for at least 3 criteria. And to go with your gut, what do you think is going to be important in this project? And can you, once you list them, and you can have more than 3, is there an overarching philosophy that you think would help you to design your project?